Well, thank you all for coming tonight. This meeting is taking place because of Gianni and Polly. They contacted me back in August with some concerns that they had. And I indicated that I was interested in hearing their concerns about Act 46 and that we would see what we could do to address those concerns. And were there any other persons that might like to also be available to hear the conversation or participate in the conversation on Act 46? They said yes. And because of that, the chairman of the Education Committee of the House of Representatives in Vermont is here and came down from Bristol. This is Representative Dave Sharp. And the vice chair came all the way down from Cambridge, Vermont, Lamoille County, Bernie Juskowitz. And another member of the Education Committee, Larry Kupeli, representing Rutland. He came down from Rutland. And then the rest of us were local. Oliver Olson is in Londonderry and Windhall and has been making presentations around this part of the state, I think actually all over the state, on Act 46. And Cynthia has been working on it, and I have been as well. So all of us are concerned about it. We want to hear from you tonight, and this is your opportunity to have a little bit of a presentation, 20 minutes, and then time for questions and answers and just sharing. So that's the format for this evening. I want to thank you very, very much, particularly Gianni and Polly for calling this meeting and for giving us the opportunity to gather together to see if we can answer questions that are of concern to you. So welcome all of you. It's great having you here. And without further ado, I'll introduce Representative Dave Sharp, Chairman of the Education Committee.
Great, thanks, Steve. Let me see if I can get this back up working again.
There you go. Got it.
So the goal of Act 46 is quality, equity, and sustainability. Our state constitution requires that we educate all the children in the state on an equitable basis. Even though the state has delegated that authority to towns for hundreds of years. The Constitution still requires that it's the state's responsibility, and therefore we as legislators cannot ignore the education in the state of our children. We must address it, we must pay attention to it. We moved quite a distance in terms of equity. The state Supreme Court reinforced the concept that we were responsible for educating all the children in our state with the Brigham decision that required an equity in funding. And we moved a fair distance along that path with Act 60 and 68. It's certainly not fully equitable by any stretch of the imagination, but it is much more equitable than it was before Act 60. And then sustainability, a number of us, including myself, as I was running for re-election last time, heard from voters that property taxes were too high and that something needed to be done to control the increasing cost of education and the pressure on property taxes. So the combination of these events and the sense that there was a growing sense in the legislature and throughout the state that we needed to do something about our school system before it all fell apart. I think I can just push a button. So there are three pieces to this, and I have to say, very few of these slides are originally mine. I borrowed most of them from Oliver Olson, who has done tremendous amount of work on analyzing Act 46 and presenting it in a slide format. I have made numerous modifications. I've also borrowed slides from the Agency of Education and one slide from Professor Tammy Cole at the University of Vermont. These are the three areas we're going to look at. First, statewide fiscal pressures. So what we're looking at the legislature in terms of money issues across the state. overview of the education finance mechanism in particular, and then Act 46 and beyond. So this is a pie graph of how money comes into the education fund. So the bulk of it is the non-homestead education tax. There's a statewide tax. The rate is set at the legislature. It applies to all non-residential property in the state. This year, I believe it's $1.52.50, if I'm correct. My posse out here, the legislators in the room, will correct me, I'm sure, if I get some of these statistics wrong. But it's $1.52.50 per $100 of value for every piece of non-residential property in the state, regardless of the town, regardless of the location. The homestead tax is a tax that's the residential property tax that's applied both on residences where people pay by property value and residents where people pay by income. And though the net effect of that, it raises another $424 million, and that it varies from community to community depending on the per pupil cost of educating students in that community. That's really the only use of the per pupil cost, is to calculate tax rates in your community. And I say that because whatever budget any community in the state votes, whatever school budget is voted, a check gets written out of the education fund for that amount, period. The per pupil costs are used to calculate the tax rate. There's $303 million transfer from the general fund that's primarily income tax and sales tax money. There's an additional 35% of the sales tax, $135 million. So there's a sizable portion of non-property tax money that comes into the education fund. Purchase and use tax, a third of the tax you pay on vehicle purchases. A little bit of Medicaid money, all of the lottery money, and a few other sources. So this is the big problem. The red line is the declining equalized pupils we've had in the last decade. Gone from roughly 100,000 to under 90,000 in 10 years.
What does that mean, equalized?
So equalized, so this is not the number of legs divided by 2 or the number of heads in a building. This, a single equalized pupil is your average, everyday, run-of-the-mill elementary school student. A high school student gets a rating of 1.3. A student from a low income, from free and reduced price lunch, gets a 1.25 rating. So, and then it's, after we get all of those numbers put together, then we boil it back down to actual number of students. The green lines is education spending. So while we've seen a tremendous drop in student population, we've seen a consistent increase in education spending.
David, is this in contemporary dollars or is this adjusted for inflation?
I don't know.
Contemporary dollars.
Okay, because I think it would be good if you had the same graph adjusted for inflation, because quite a bit of that is probably inflation. So this is a really important graph. I just think without understanding the real cost and the real value adjusted for inflation, I don't think you're giving the full picture.
So what has inflation been over the last decade?
Inflation has been 1, 2, 3% for the past 10 years, maybe a little higher if you go back 20 years. But if you have 3% for 20 years, things double. So I just think you need, if you're going to do this over time, I think you need the inflation adjusted. So I think it would be flatter. It would still go up, but I think it would be flatter. And because this is such an important slide for you, I think it's unfortunate that you haven't provided that adjustment too.
Yes, sir.
Just a very quick one, I'm sorry. Ashley. Just a quick question in regards to the equalized pupil. Because it's not a 1-for-1, in other words, it's a percentage point, how much would the number of free and reduced students factor into the decline? In other words, because a higher number for an average student, if you will, it's a lower percentage point, I believe you said, for free and reduced.
So you guys asked some great questions that are gonna make me go back and work on this slide,
Well,
and I
let me ask you,
appreciate
because I
that.
know from being in the local school system,
Yeah.
that number has
Yeah.
increased dramatically in the past.
I've presented this slide at least 10 times and these questions have not come up, so. I actually, and I mumbled this out at the end, I believe that in the end that these are actually actual pupils.
That they came back to that.
Because it comes back to that. These pupils are all weighted, so if you look at a individual school, the number may vary off of actual number of students, but when it's done at the state level, it's brought back to the actual number of students. But I will have to investigate that to make sure, but I'm pretty sure that we are at an actual number of per pupil of heads, if we count the heads in the state, of under 90,000, in the realm of 88,500 students.
And this is K through 12?
This is K through 12.
And Dave, if you look at actual students, because I've looked at this a lot of different ways, it's basically the same. The reason, because I actually put this slide together, the reason I used equalized pupils rather than actual bodies is that within education and finance, we always speak to equalized pupils. So just to be consistent, because otherwise if you just use regular students, then people start saying, well, you're not using equalized pupils, so. But it's pretty, the trend is the same.
Yeah.
Good question though.
All right. Despite the fact that we have lost a tremendous number of students, we have essentially the same number of teachers. This is teaching certificate teachers in the state, and roughly the same number of paraprofessionals in the state. So 80% of the costs of running a school is personnel costs, both salaries and benefits. And since we have not reduced our personnel, it's not surprising that our costs have gone up. And those two previous slides put together yield this. Our current student to staff ratio is we have one paid staff person in the building for every 4.67 students. And we are very much outliers when we are compared to the rest of the country with regard to this statistic. Not only do we have the demographic of a declining student population, we also have a demographic shift in our tax-paying population. People who are funding schools. And this hump right here is the baby boomer generation. This blue block is your taxpayers, where we get most of our money from. And here's student population. So what we're going to see here in the next couple of decades is we're going to see our tax-paying population, this baby boom bump, if you will, move into fixed incomes. So they're no longer going to be making the $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. They're going to be making the $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. So here's what it looks like. The non-residential property tax rate that I spoke of that brings in the bulk of the money is a fixed rate. Here it says 5.35, 1.535. I think it's 1.525.
No, it's 3.5, I didn't want to say it before, but it is 3.5.
Okay, thank you. And that money goes into the education fund directly. Other state revenues, like the transfer from the general fund, and the residential property tax rate, the base rate is 99 cents per $100 of value of your homes. And that yields $9,459 per pupil. Average in the state is $1.57 for a home rate, and that's going to yield $15,000 per equalized pupil. That's a little above average. This is also a little above average, but you get the general idea. You spend more per pupil, and this rate goes up. This doesn't change, this doesn't change. This rate goes up. And it increases proportionally to your spending. So you spent $15,000. The last slide was roughly $10,000 at roughly $1. And this rate is roughly $15,000, and it's roughly $1.50. So it's a 50% increase in spending per pupil yields a 50% increase in your tax rate. So what we hear an awful lot is, well, our budget only went up on 1% or less than 1%. How come my tax rate's going up so high? And here's how it happens. This is an example of a community. They're spending $27 million in 14, 687, 316, and in 15 they spent $27,866,000, a 0.6% increase, hardly anything, right? Shouldn't affect much. But what the headline doesn't tell you is this community lost students. They lost 50 students. And since we calculate taxes based on the number of pupils, this community also lost $400,000 in other funding, maybe small schools grant, maybe some federal Title I money, maybe some SPED money. They lost some money that is not counted. So they lost $400,000 there, they lost pupils, and so now that per pupil spending moves from $16,000 to $17,000 and a 7.5% increase. So we move from a 0.6% increase in the tax rate in this particular community to a 7.5% tax increase because of the loss of pupils and the loss of federal funds. And this is how tax rates get calculated. You take your education spending per pupil and you divide it by the state base amount. Remember that number, 9,459 I referred to earlier? So the 17,000 gets divided by 9, gives you a district spending adjustment. You multiply that spending adjustment times the base tax rate and you get the local tax rate. Here's an example. Going from 2014 to 2015 and a $200,000 house in this community. Yet the tax rate in 14 was 1.523, $1.52 and a third of a cent on every $100 of value of the house. And we calculated that 7.5% increase. Now it's up to $1.63.7. There's another factor involved, called the CLA. The CLA is the relationship of the sales in your community to the listed value of the community. So if this $200,000 house is really selling for more than $200,000, then the CLA is over 100%. If it's selling less than $200,000, the CLA is, I said that backwards twice. Thank you, Oliver. If it's selling for more than $200,000, the CLA is less because it's only representing $200,000 only represents 97.55% of the actual value. So the actual value of this house is $205,000 or something like that. In this case, it's selling for less than its listed value, which happened after the Great Recession. So its value is really less than $200,000. So the $200,000 represents 104% of its actual value. So that's another 6.6% change. So now this 0.6 increase in this fictional community's increase in spending, their bill that they sent to the, is going to result in a 12.2% increase in taxes, or for this particular family, it's going to be a $358 increase in their taxes. because of a 0.6% increase in spending in that community. So that's difficult to wrap your mind around, but that's the way the system works.
So basically, if we were to keep people here that are having kids and putting their kids in the system, it would be much less than issue.
If we have more kids in the system, you change the number you're dividing by and the cost per pupil goes down. So that exacerbates, the loss of students exacerbates any spending problem. If the spending were to go down at the same rate as the loss of students, the tax rate would be stable. If house values were stable, then the tax rate would be stable. But we have all of these moving parts, and so they all have to be taken into account in calculating the tax rate.
In other states that are spending less per pupil, have you compared outcomes, performances of students?
So our outcomes in Vermont are excellent. They're in the top 5 by, I mean, there's numerous ways you can measure outcomes, and different rating agencies have different ways of doing that, but we're always in the top 5.
And I know Arlington a few years ago was rated very high across the state. How will this consolidation plan, if Arlington is forced to join another district, how have you done any studies on how that might be impacted? Because we were in a private school at one point with our child, and we did come back to the public school because it is.
Because it's so good.
Yes, exactly. So, have you guys done any studies as to how that can be?
So I'm not smart enough to know every community in the state. I'm barely smart enough to understand my community of Bristol and a couple of the neighboring communities in terms of, you know, excellence of education and how that area should move forward. It's one of the reasons why we left as much local control in this process as we absolutely could, because local communities understand better what their local situation is and how best to move forward. We do know that there is great disparity in educational opportunity from one school to another, and we do know that there's a great variation in cost from one school to another, and those don't necessarily match up. It's not like the school spending the most money necessarily has the best opportunities for children. So where do we go from here? So here's the system. This is courtesy of Professor Tammy Kolb. This is the system, and she has, you can find it on the House Education website, her whole series of slides that shows how we got here. This is the design of our current education system. Would any of us sit down to design an education system that looked remotely like this? We have such incredible lines of conflict of responsibility, authority, and involvement of parents, board members, superintendents, principals. I know the principal in my school district has 20 night meetings a month. We just lost the 3rd superintendent in 5 years. It is extraordinarily difficult across the state to find and hire and keep quality superintendents because it is just the most convoluted job. There are 7 boards, all of whom think they run you, that they're your boss if you're the superintendent. It turns out it's the supervisory union board that is your boss, that is in my area, meets once or twice a year. How can you possibly have supervision or accountability over an employee if you only meet as a board, a volunteer board, once or twice a year? And we have the similar problem with principals. Who are they responsible to? Are they responsible to the local board, to the superintendent, to the supervisory union board, to parents? And all of these people think that they have control over you, and it becomes an untenable situation. So how do we erase some of these lines? How do we make our system of education make more sense for our students? And that's what we tried to do. That's our effort in Act 46. To move the state towards a more sustainable education governance, encourage local decisions that, one, provide substantial equity. We have a long way to go in equity of student opportunities. Lead students to meet or exceed state educational quality standards. Maximize operational efficiencies through greater flexibility to manage, share, and transfer resources. I've heard a lot about this from business managers across the state who think that this is the most immediate benefit of Act 46 is being able to run their business offices more efficiently and save considerable amount of money doing it. If we could save a ton of money in administration, think how much more we can offer our students. Promote transparency and accountability, and deliver at a cost that taxpayers can afford.
But Dave, isn't it true that administration is just a small fraction of the total costs? So you can't save money there, you have to save money on the other staff?
You know, that's a really interesting question that nobody can answer because our school, we have 13 different governance models and 9 different operating systems in the state.
So there's no comparability?
So there's no valid way to collect and compare data. What data we do have shows that we are an outlier compared to other states across the country in administrative costs, both at the supervisor union level, but more importantly, at the school level. I was on the way up here, Bernie's telling me a conversation he had with a friend that has a school district of 100,000 students and 1 superintendent. We have 88,000 students and 60 superintendents. I'm not suggesting, although someone has, but it wasn't me that suggested that we have 1 school district for the entire state. I don't think that's the right answer.
How many assistant superintendents does that 1 superintendent have?
No, I don't. Those are good questions.
What kind of outcomes does that have?
Is there another model, state model, that is close to what Act 46 is trying to do? Is there a comparable?
In a different state in the country?
Yeah.
Not really, because there's a lot of literature out there on small schools. And the national standard for a small school is a school in less than 300 students. By that standard, we only have 3 schools that aren't small schools in the entire state. And we have micro schools. We have schools with 15, 10 kids. We have school districts with 20 or 30 students in them. So we just don't fit in any comparison with any state. I mean, you read a paper on small schools, and they're talking about the schools much bigger than 80% of the schools in this state. So we put preferred districts out there, preferred governance model of 900 plus students. And I have to tell a little story about this. I was very much against this concept 5 years ago. And I went to a lecture at UVM. And the lecturer was talking about this very point, that Vermont schools were just so radically smaller than any schools in the country. But talking about, well, what is the optimum size for a school district? And he said 1,700 students. You get more than 1,700, maybe you need to start getting the assistants, maybe your economies of scale don't matter so much anymore. I think larger is not always better, but to a point, and this lecturer's point was, to 1,700 students, there are incredible efficiencies and opportunities that you can offer students that you can't offer in smaller districts. We settled on 900 students in a negotiated settlement with the Senate. We started at 1,100. There's another merger process in current law that calls for 1,250 students. But somewhere in that area is probably the most efficient setup that we can come to for Vermont. And there is a proposal for an alternative governance schedule. I'll get into that later. Transition encourage local development of mergers. As Oliver likes to say, find your dance partner. And I think, you know, I had a map up earlier that many of you saw. I think this, south of Route 4, this is a difficult conversation. The patchwork of differences in how schools are operated or not operated, at what level tuitioning happens, and you have operating towns isolated among choice towns, and you have a choice town isolated around operating towns. And so this conversation is not an easy conversation in this part of the state. And I appreciate that. And we dumped an awful lot of this work in the laps of the local school boards. We did not make mandatory changes at the state. I think we would have been ridden out of Dodge had we done that. There is a high level of value in this state for local decision making. So it's in your court to figure this out for your communities.
What does that mean functionally, to merge the district? Arlington has like something like 300 or so. What is it? What's that?
We're under 5.
Under 5. What does that mean functionally? Does that mean merging administrations, or does that mean closing the Arlington school and merging it with other schools?
So I want to be really clear, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about closing schools and stopping choice. This bill does neither. In fact, I strongly believe that if we do nothing, many of the small schools in this state will close. Already this year, we've had 2 schools close up in the Northeast Kingdom, Guildhall and Concord. And I think that there are many schools that are just on the verge of closing. They can no longer sustain their school. And school board members and community members don't want to lose their school, but they're at the point of throwing up their hands, which they did in Guildhall, and say, we just can't manage it anymore. And then families are left to figure it out for themselves how they're going to educate their children. And I think Bolton is a proof in the pudding. The only district we have that has formed is the Chittenden East District, and Bolton Valley, Bolton School, the Smiley School in Bolton, was on the verge of closing. This tax rate was going through the roof, and this number of pupils was declining, and they just weren't going to be able to keep their doors open. And Chittenden East formed as a large integrated school district. Bolton School is now alive and well. It's one of the reasons that the governor chose the Smiley School to sign the bill. And what they did there, that's an example of what can happen, is that they had, I believe it was in kindergarten, they had 6 kindergartners coming into Bolton, and they had 24 kindergartners coming into Jericho. That's 2 teachers in Jericho and 1 in Bolton. So what they were able to do is they invited people from Jericho who might want to send their students to the Bolton school because they were actually physically closer to the Bolton school. Parents said, yeah, sure, we'd love to do that. So they were able to put 15 in each school and have 2 teachers instead of 3, and revitalize the Bolton school all at the same time. Saving money, better opportunities for kids, and keeping a small school alive for that small community. So is everybody a Bolton Valley? Probably not. But I think there are opportunities like this across the state to find efficiencies, do a better job for our children, and save taxpayer dollars all at the same time. We phased out small phantom students. You probably don't know that you pay for empty seats. Your tax dollars. And the biggest example of that is a school with 100 pupils, 100 equalized pupils. 44 of them are phantom students. They're not there. That school actually only has 56 children in the building. 44 of them are phantom students. We put this mechanism in place. I wasn't there, the legislature did it. Understandably, when we started losing students in the state, if a school had 100 students and they lost 10, they said, oh my God, we can't figure this out financially in 1 year. Give us a break. So the legislature, in its wisdom, said, okay, we'll give you a break. We'll only allow a reduction of 3.5% of your class size, of your school size, and then we'll protect you at that level. So we'll let you count 96 and a half students instead of 90, and you should be able to manage that. And that helped. That helped a lot of schools. The problem was it kept declining over time. And the way the law was implemented, written and implemented, those numbers kept snowballing. So we have a bunch of these phantom students that were intended in a way to be a one-year cushion, and they've hung on for over a decade. So we got rid of them. With the exception, phantom students do continue to, this protection continues to exist in these larger integrated school districts. But I'll tell you what, if you have 900 students, you probably won't lose. I mean, if you lose 3.5% of 900 students, you lost a bunch of kids, and you deserve a little protection. Small schools grants are converted to merger support grants in most cases. In some cases, when you can demonstrate excellence and you're geographically isolated, then a small schools grant may be able to continue. But we wanted to make sure that if you were a small school, and let's say 3 or 4 small schools got together to form this 900 unit school district, we wanted to help that school district survive. And we didn't want to yank the small schools grant out from under them. So we left that small schools grant in place for those small schools as a merger support grant that remains in perpetuity unless the school is closed. So if you close the school, then you don't get the small schools grant that went with that school, which is another indication of our intention to keep schools open.
But Arlington doesn't get a small school grant. I think the only school in this area may be Sunderland that does. I don't know if Danby
Yeah.
gets a small school grant. I'm not
I think
sure.
Sunderland does.
Sunderland does, but
Sunderland,
I'm not
yeah.
sure about Danby.
Danby does.
Danby does,
Yeah.
yeah. So but Arlington is not a small school in their definition.
We also put temporary cost control mechanism in place. We heard from taxpayers loud and clear, you have to do something to control our property taxes. And so what we put in place was a new excess spending penalty for 2 years only that applies to all school districts in the state. And it looks at the overall increase in spending from our education fund at 2%, which is roughly $25 million increase. And it says, on average, across the state, we're going to keep spending at 2% or less. But we graduated it, recognizing that there is one school in the state that already spends $20,000 per pupil. They don't need 2% more. And there are some schools that spend in the neighborhood of 10,000, and they're going to get nearly 5% increase is going to be available for those schools. And what happens when this has been widely referred to as a cap. It is not a cap. What it is any money per pupil that's spent over this limit is you're double taxed on.
Excuse me, does that take into account any of the contracts with teachers, with school administrators, which already have those built-in increases because they've already been negotiated by local school boards?
It has to follow.
How can that, if you're only gonna increase by 2%, and your teacher contract, your para contracts, whatever, busing contracts, are already more than 2%, then those school districts are already in trouble.
I'll tell you what happened in my town of Starksboro. I don't know all your little communities. You have to figure that out. But I'll tell you what happened in my town of Starksboro. The school was losing students, and the staff was not decreasing. And the superintendent recommended to the local school board that they needed to decrease 1 teacher and 2 aides in that school. Total of $135,000 reduction in the budget. And Starksboro is one of the few remaining communities that still votes their budget on the floor. So what did local voters do? they put that 135,000 back in the budget and raised the tax rate. And because we have a statewide tax system, and because no community in the state raises their additional local money on their local tax rate, no town in the state raises their additional spending over the base on their local tax rate. So all of us helped pay Starksboro for that $135,000 increase in their budget. Now somebody, sooner or later, has to say, stop. And we put this in place. It doesn't put a cap in place. What it says is, you're going to actually pay your share if you go over this. Because if you're paying double the tax over the threshold, now you really are paying, and the rest of the state is not subsidizing that increase in your town. Here.
What happens to all of the things that are so far out of the school board's control, like Blue Cross Blue Shield asking for an 8.5% increase? Those premiums aren't in the school board's control.
That's correct.
Right.
But if you were to reduce staff,
They have to come up with an extra 10% of the budget to cover that?
it's not at 10% of the budget. It's 7.9% of the healthcare costs, which are 20% of the salary costs. So you're right. It's not as big as it might seem at first. The way to do it is to reduce staff. If you reduce staff, you don't have to pay the healthcare increases, you don't have to pay the salary, and you don't have to pay the other benefits that are associated with that staff.
Teachers, we start losing more students, the school systems go down the hill, and then everybody that has kids in that school system is gonna move. It's very simple.
But the other thing is, my understanding for Arlington, that this year they have to fulfill the state mandate to provide pre-K for 3-year-olds, which is a state mandate. Just fulfilling that is gonna put Arlington's budget over its allowed increase. So just fulfilling, this is from the superintendent of the Batkill Valley Supervisory Union. So that seems to me to be fundamentally unfair. Setting aside the question of compensation increases or anything like that, you're fulfilling a state mandate, and that's putting you over the cap, and you're gonna be punished.
So I'll answer that directly, and then I want to say something else. So preschool is an interesting conundrum. For school districts that have already operated pre-K programs, your statement is accurate. For communities that are instituting new pre-K programs, there is a $3,000 cost. There is also a 0.46 increase in the per pupil, in the way you count pupils.
For the cap? For the cap?
Yes, for everything. For the new thresholds and for calculating your tax rate. So if you're a school district that is adding a new pre-K program, it's financially advantageous for that community to start this pre-K program. It helps you keep under the cap because 0.46 of an average pupil's 14,000, so 0.46 is a little less than half of 14, so 7, so 6. Let's say it's $6,000.
It's more than 3,000.
It's more than 3,000 in virtually every community in the state. So if it's only costing you 3,000 and you get credit for 6,000, it's actually saving you money in your tax calculation.
In certain circumstances, but
In
not
schools
in
that don't currently have a pre-K program.
In schools that don't currently have a pre-K program.
What about Arlington?
Because we have it before, and now we have to expand to 3, and
Yeah,
that's where I was.
it's a problem. So the second thing I wanted to say is that we recognize there has been an awful lot of concern. Healthcare is a big concern, pre-K is a concern. I think I think I have a list of like 6 issues on the table. At one point in our discussion during the session was to allow the increase to be applied either to the per pupil cost or to the overall budget. And there are, I don't know, I think there's 2 or 3 other ideas that I have written down. Our committee is going to meet on the 18th of November, and the Speaker of the House has already said publicly that we're going to take a look at these thresholds and to see if we can't make some adjustments that make it a little bit more easy to handle. Maybe taking the increases in healthcare costs off the table or some other mechanism that makes it easier for districts to comply. But the bottom line is that we have got to reduce the number of paid professionals in our building. We have 1.1 paid adult to 4.67 students. If we increase that just to 1 to 5, if that's the only increase we made, we'd save $70 million out of our education fund. That's 7 cents on our tax rate. This is the area. My school board in Starksboro did the right thing. They are responsible for the education of the kids in that community. The principals and the superintendents, I have to say, I went to the School Boards Association meeting, and the school boards were railing against this spending threshold. It's a terrible thing, you've got to get rid of it. You've got to either delay it or get rid of it. And I had a note passed to me by a superintendent who is deeply committed to quality education for children in her school district that said, listening to this, please don't do that. If we don't have pressure from the state, we will not be able to do what we know is the right thing to be doing in our schools.
So reducing staff levels sounds great for saving money, but what about those towns that don't have staff? What about towns like Sandgate that don't operate schools? Towns like Sunderland that don't have a high school or a junior high school? We can't reduce staff, we don't have staff.
So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side of that coin you're on, tuitioning is exempt from the caps. I'm sorry, they're not caps, the high spending threshold. So we couldn't figure out a way to do it. We don't want to be seen as driving closing of schools or driving relinquishing choice. That is not the intention. It's expressly said in the bill. And we didn't want any of the provisions in the bill to be perceived as people waving a flag saying, oh, you're trying to kill choice, and other people raising a flag saying, oh, you're trying to close my school. We are not trying to do either one of those. What we're trying to do is bring sense to the confusing and expensive school system we have, and at the same time deliver better opportunities to an awful lot of kids in this state that don't have the opportunities that they ought to be getting.
In terms of reducing staff, I mean, that sounds good for keeping the expenses down 1 year, but I know Sandgate has seen pretty big fluctuations in the number of students that, you know, over a 10-year period. And you're talking about opportunities for kids. I mean, one of the things that I think Arlington has going for it is the teaching staff is outstanding in a lot of ways. And if you're, you know, letting people go to meet the requirements of the cap 1 year, then 5 years down the road, isn't it gonna make, like, retain good staff harder?
So
and won't that affect their opportunities?
we expect, you saw my chart about the aging population, teachers are aging. I was a teacher for 20 years. I got to be 65, I retired. We're going to see, and in addition to just the regular aging of population, we made an agreement with NEA and with teachers 5 years ago that they would contribute more of their salary towards the pension funds. When the Great Recession hit, the pension funds were in trouble, and we needed to do something. And so the deal was, all the teachers in the state will contribute more. I think it's up to 5% now of their salary will go into the pension fund. In return, teachers' spouses will get subsidized on their retirement health care, provided that the teacher work 5 additional years. 5 years are up. And so we expect a number of additional retirements to go on throughout the state. So we have retirements just due to aging, and we have retirements due to this benefit, this extra benefit that teachers maybe worked 2 or 3 years longer than they would have otherwise in order to get their spouses some subsidy on health care. So how many pink slips would actually have to be delivered, I think is relatively few. We've already had nearly 500 teachers retire this year. If we don't replace all those slots, and I recognize that some of them will have to be replaced, but some of them we can say, you know, that was the right thing to happen. It's time to reduce our staff. We won't refill that position.
But Dave, that's.
Can I do here first?
I'm just wondering I hate to put you, but what do you know about the dynamics of this community? I think most of the people here are Arlington, Sandgate, possibly Sunderland. Do you know sort of what the state of our schools are and what the options are for us in this area under Act 46?
I know very little. Yeah, Cynthia.
I mean, I think right there, that's the problem with what Act 46 is doing, right there. I think, you know, I understand about the retirements and they won't all be replaced, and even when they are, they'll be replaced with teachers who probably will cost less because there'll be new young teachers. So right there, that process might be getting you guys the reduction in the student-staff ratio that you're after. It's not so clear to me that the forced mergers are going to do that. And I think it's very important that people understand that if you do the merger where you really combine boards, the local school boards go away. And you
Not
have
necessarily.
in one version of it they do, and you have one board for the entire merged district. There's a lot of variations. You can retain boards in some combinations, but there's real questions about in a merged board whether smaller towns will have representation, because it'll be one person, one vote, depending on how it's accomplished. But I think the real problem that I'm hearing from my constituents is that we thought we were doing pretty well. I mean, as Rachel says, Arlington High School has won a number of awards. We have this bizarre tiny supervisory union, which is Arlington and Sandgate in it, that the state keeps trying to make vanish, but we're actually doing a pretty good job. The BRSU is doing a pretty good job. Everything you say about the bizarre system we have is true, but it's not clear to me that Act 46 is going to replace it with something better, or just something bizarre in a different way. And I'd rather have bizarre functional rather than bizarre unknown dysfunctional. So that's our problem. And you know, if you do a good presentation on how education is financed, and it's really useful, and I hope people got a lot out of it, but not to get any sort of takeaway about what does this mean for our schools and what our school boards are struggling with. This is a really big problem, and I think the act needs to be changed so that it's easier for school districts to continue the way they are if they're doing a good job. Arlington has no obvious merger partner other than Mount Anthony and Bennington, and they left that on purpose. Sandgate is going to end up merging with some other choice district that has no geographic continuity. This is a system that's working. So I really understand the goals of this, but I just think the mandate has gone too far. Schools that see educational and financial opportunities and benefits should do it, and they should be rewarded. I'd rather you weren't rewarding them with property tax dollars. I'd rather the state was rewarding them. Because you may not realize that every time a town gets a property tax reduction because they merged, it's coming from the ed fund. It's coming from your own property taxes. So I just think that more than the variable, what did you call it, cost threshold, more than that component of Act 46 needs to be adjusted in the coming session. I just don't see that as working for this district. And everybody who looked at this district, Rebecca Holcomb, when she came down, she all said, gosh, it doesn't work down here. And I think that's what we see. It doesn't work down here.
Thank you.
We kind of told you that during the session too.
I mean, Cynthia's here to represent our constituents and our community, and I feel like there's a bit of a disregard of the comments that she's making. Our school is growing. So I hope that the takeaway from this group gathered here cutting staff is not an option. We have increased enrollment within our schools.
So does Sunderland. Because of the teachers.
And so does
But
Sunderland, because of the quality of the
But now it's
schools.
gonna look like this.
So, you know, I'm presenting the bill.
I understand.
The
I just
overview
wish
from,
you knew a little more
in
about this.
Montpelier. The speaker asked for suggestions on how to improve the system. There, we have plenty of work to do with this state. Now, maybe this, people in this room and maybe the towns you represent are fantastic. That does not erase the problem in the rest of the state. We have a high school in the state. The UVM has a wonderful program where the valedictorian of every school in the state can go free to UVM. And there was a student, a valedictorian, that didn't apply to UVM. And I spoke with the president of UVM and I said, well, you know, what's going on? And he said, I'm very disturbed about this. And he went and he looked into this. And it turned out that the school that this student was going to wasn't providing the courses that the university required in order to enter the university. So even though there was a free ticket waiting, the student couldn't qualify to go to the university.
Yeah, but then Dave, you fix that school. You don't disrupt all the schools that are functioning well. You target the assistants instead of disrupting schools that are doing well. That's not a justification for changing everybody's system when they're doing well.
The structure does not function well in 98% of the state.
Maybe they
Yeah.
should take
So
our to the
what's driving this whole thing is that tax already happens, correct?
That's one of the drivers. A bigger driver, in many people's view, is the outcomes that students, the opportunities that students have. We do well in many regards. We're in the top 5 in the nation, except we don't send nearly enough of a percentage of our students to higher education of any sort
Because there's not enough
beyond.
economic development for parents to afford to send their kids to college?
Money is part of it, but it's not the only piece. The money problem is true across the country, and yet our percentages are lower than the rest of the country. The other area where we fall woefully short is educating students from low-income families.
So, the tax side of it, everything that goes into the Vermont Education Fund is incredibly complex. She shows how that's all calculated and everything. Where's the slide that shows where all that money goes? Because it's not all going to education. Where is the act that addresses everything else that comes out of the education fund? Why is it only education that's being attacked?
So like I said in the beginning, whatever every school district votes in the state, a check comes out of the education fund to pay for that. That's where $1.2 billion go. 300 million of it goes, 150 million goes to special ed costs, which is an area that I'm determined to work on. I think we spend too much money and actually stigmatize children in many instances. We don't do a very good job in special ed, and we spend a lot of money not doing a very good job. So that's half of it.
If you're reducing staff.
Hmm?
How do you do that if you're reducing staff?
So we can go into special ed a little bit. Special ed, we do a reimbursement model with special ed, and we say we're going to pay 60% of your special ed costs, up to $50,000 per pupil, and if it gets over that, we're going to pay 90%. So if I sent you to the grocery store and I said I'm going to pay 60% of whatever you buy, your buying habits might be different than if you paid the full bill. So that's one piece. Another piece is that we require the documentation of special education in every 15-minute increments. So if you've got 10 kids in your school and you've got 3 special educators, those 3 special educators probably spend 5 out of every 15 minutes documenting who they're spending time with. It is much easier documentation process if we assign a paraprofessional with each student all day. So we can have 10 paraprofessionals instead of 3 trained special educators, and they're each assigned to one of those special students all day. And the documentation becomes much easier. The education doesn't get any better. There's no support that says that paraprofessional spending, an individual aide spending all day with a special student increases that student's learning. There are some exciting models in the state. There are 5 SWIFT programs in the state where they have moved towards classroom aides and project-based education in heterogeneous settings. They're relieved of this documentation. So now they can move about the classroom and address students' problems as they arise. Secondly, I've had special educators tell me the minute you put a paraprofessional, a one-on-one aide with a student, you might just as well paint a red R on their forehead and you stigmatize them for their entire school career. So we have some serious educational problems with how we do special ed, never mind the cost issues. So it's an area that we need work in. I'm not going to stand here and say that Act 46 works perfectly for every corner of the state. Of course it doesn't. We're looking at it. Our responsibility is to look at the state system as a whole. If there are mechanisms in place that if you do due diligence, you work hard at finding dance partners, you analyze what the education is for your children and how you can improve the children by combining or working with other communities, and you get to the point where there's no answer, that's what you file with the State Board of Education. And there is the option that the State Board can look at that and say, you know what, you're right, keep on doing what you're doing.
What's the penalty? What's the penalty?
They'll put you somewhere.
There's no penalty.
Yes, they'll put you somewhere. If they don't agree that you've justified going on as you're doing, they'll put you somewhere.
But to play devil's advocate, they could agree as well.
Yes.
Correct?
They could agree.
They've said there's gonna be a really high bar for that. That's what the board itself has
So it just
said.
makes it.
They
that
could
much
agree,
more
number
hard for us
one.
to justify.
Number two,
Yeah, we perform it hard one.
Number 2, they cannot, the agency and the State Board of Education are prohibited from forcing a school to give up choice or forcing a school to close. So the state board cannot make that decision. Communities can vote that because they think that's the best idea for their community. But if the community goes through all this due diligence and really looks at the education, I mean seriously, not just say, oh, our school's fine. Look at your school. Where are you successful? Where are you falling short? In the areas where you're falling short, how can you make it better? And can part of making that better mean cooperation with a different community? And if you go through all that, and you come to the point where Arlington says, you know, the only thing that's viable for this town is to continue to maintain our school in the way we do, and we serve our 300 students well, then I believe the state board will listen to that. And there is no penalty for doing it.
Arlington to be first at one point, didn't they?
Pardon?
Didn't they want Arlington to be first in the mergers at one point? I thought?
Yes.
I don't know about that. They
Without
wanted to
doing
get
any
rid
of
of.
the due diligence?
No, they wanted to get rid of, they've always wanted to get rid of this tiny supervisory union.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that they could put Arlington, they can't force us to merge or close or anything like that. But I thought, my impression was that if Arlington did not merge with anybody else and asked to stay independent and they said no, they could put us in another SU. In other words, they could put us with West Vermont or put us with BRSU, if those SUs even exist. I mean, maybe I've misunderstood that, but that was my understanding, that if you ended up with orphan districts that didn't have dance partners, the board can put them somewhere, not into a merger where all the boards are combined in one, but into an SU. And the history of this, Dave, here is that Arlington felt it was mistreated in the Bennington SU and left. Sandgate felt it was mistreated in the BRSU and left, and that's why the Back Hill Valley SU exists. And the two towns have worked together, I think, pretty well. You know, Sandgate with the choice and Arlington with its schools, and they've done a good job. And it's just very hard to contemplate being put in different places with different partners when what you had worked. Now, I take your point about we can always do better about sharing and cooperation, but the restrictions on the combination that you have to have the same degree of choice make it really, really hard to
Well,
find dance partners.
let me go a little bit further. I don't want to take up all the time. So here's an example of what's, I love this slide because we have a whole bunch of people sitting up here saying, boy, I'm glad it's not me that's having trouble. We're all in this together. So here's 3 standalone towns. In the green town, a teacher retires and 3 students leave. So the school board dilemma is, do you reduce educational opportunities or do you raise the cost per pupil? That's not an easy decision for any school board. And my hat is off to school boards in this state who do some of the most important work on a volunteer basis and get little or no thanks for it.
But you just heard Nicole say that our school is growing.
Okay.
And part of the reason it's growing is because it's gained deservedly a reputation for having good programs and having good teachers. And I think all these ideas about, can we look at special ed and how is that implemented, and all these things are important things to look at, but is there a way to do that without sort of making it part of an ultimatum that we may have to merge with other supervisory unions that we aren't part of because they may not actually do it as well as we do?
I can't answer that question. I mean, it's a rhetorical question, really. All I can really say is we have many, many students in this state that we are not providing opportunities for, and we're not providing those opportunities at a very high cost. Now, we could all put our head in the sand and say, I'm fine, screw you. Or we can be serious about improving the educational opportunities for all the students in this state.
But how is my son's potential loss of junior high school choice equating to some other kid's gain? How does that even follow?
Why is there a huge sacrifice to the towns that are doing well?
I don't think there needs to be sacrifice.
Well, according to this law, as I understand it, the existing towns need to merge with other towns that have the same level of choice, but we're all different right here. There isn't a logical choice, and Sunderland has junior high school choice and high school choice, and it looks like the best partners that we can find that are within the geographical locations that we're allowed, we're gonna have to give up some of our choice. Now, you say that that's not what it's designed for, but that's what it's doing.
Yeah.
And they have to, because otherwise they'll lose their small school grant. So, you can say, well, you can figure it out, we're giving you all this choice, but you're not, because if they don't do the merger and reduce their choice, they lose the small school grant. So that's not freedom of action. That's being forced to make the choice.
It's paying the real cost of educating
But
students.
it's not
that's what
improving
this
my
model
son's
does, right?
opportunities. It is not improving opportunities for my son or the other children in our district.
It could. It doesn't.
The lack of choice is gonna do that?
So
I don't see that.
So one of the things that it's been suggested that I say, that others have said, that I think is true, is if we can think about what the possibilities are and then what the hurdles are to get there, then the legislature can address what those, or the agency can address what those hurdles are. If all we're going to do is talk about how we can't do this and we can't do that, then we aren't going to go anywhere.
I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Hurdles? What?
I do. My husband and I, we've only lived here for 7 years. I grew up in Southern California. We started our family in Utah. Those are places that are much bigger. My town probably had, in Southern California, probably had like 50 elementary schools. They're just building a second high school, and there's certainly a lot of strife about that in the community.
But different doesn't always mean worse, and I understand what you're saying about local changing things, but, you know, like the one thing I haven't heard is bigger class size.
Is what?
I know people in Vermont like to keep their tiny class sizes, but for my kids, that didn't necessarily benefit them. I don't think that helped them at all, not having more people in the classroom. It's easier for a teacher. I'm a substitute now, I understand that. I understand the impact of the special educators in the classroom or the, you know, all of that, but different doesn't always mean worse. And having representatives on a board that covers, I mean, I personally, coming from those different communities, I don't understand why there's, geographically, we're probably the closest compared to other areas of the state. We've got, you know, Bennington that's not very far away, and we've got here in Arlington, and then Manchester, we're so close. Why isn't it just one? I mean, that's a strange thing to me coming from out of the area. Now, as a parent, I understand some of these emotions, and certainly I want to keep school choice. I live in Sunderland, but different doesn't always mean that you lose quality. I don't know why that means that you have to lose good teachers. Teachers are good. They're going to be good whether you change your union or not. I understand that it changes programs that are allowed or how structure is done, but you're still going to have good staff. You're still going to have good people. I'm not, you know, again, I'm not a professional involved in the schools. I'm just a parent, but I can see that can be.
So an alternative is to retain the supervisory union structure and have the lowest number of practical school districts within that supervisory structure. So state law prohibits having the previous slide, which was all these school districts under one school district, some of which are choice and some of which are operating schools. But you could have a system like this where you have a district that operates and you also have a district that offers choice within the supervisory union.
That's essentially Arlington right now. That's Arlington, that's the Battenkill Valley Supervisory Union. So we're done.
I've learned that I truly live in Lake Wobegon because every community I visited is above average and every school is above average.
So maybe 98% of the state is not in as bad a shape as you thought.
Here's a timeline. So here's one of the things that you could keep in mind. So this is Olympic high jump. I don't know how many of you are high jumpers, but back in the 1900s, we did the old scissors kick, and the the gold medal was won at just over 1.8 meters. Then some innovative jumper came along with the Western roll, and son of a gun, the bar was raised, and now we're up to 2 meters. Because they looked at the world differently, they said there's got to be a better way to do it, and found a new way to operate. And then in the 50s and 60s, the straddle came along, and now we're up almost to 2.2 meters. And recently, the Fosbury flop, and now we're up over 2.4 meters. It's this kind of innovative thinking that we need to do in our school districts.
Did they have to legislate that you do those moves though? Because if it's really good, people are gonna do it because it works. I don't think they had to legislate those.
I understand that there are a number of people that don't like change.
No, they don't like stupid change. Stupid change.
I bet they had to legislate the financing for the Olympics that they were in.
Yeah.
My husband and I just moved here from Connecticut last August.
Yeah.
It was prior. We love change. We left Connecticut and raced to the hills of Vermont. We've been here, our family home has been here for the last 60 years. We've paid our taxes, his family has paid the taxes in that house diligently for the last 60 years. And we came here knowing about the benefits of school choice, and we decided to make a change to progressive education for our daughter. And we have absolutely embraced it. We are in a fantastic small school in Manchester where we have excellent teachers. It breaks my heart to think that I have to potentially remove my child from what she knows, both kindergarten and first grade, to a completely different school structure. And then,
I don't know why you would think that. I don't think that's not
because
part
I
of
can't
Act
afford to
46.
send it there if I don't have school choice.
There's no intention to take away school choice.
That hasn't been answered. That's what's happening. I mean, that was the intention, but that is what's happening.
You're
If
saying
we're
there's
not
no
getting that
intention, but over the course of what you have there, what's going to go on, things are gonna happen. Intention or not.
And that school will be vastly affected. They will lose about half of their students. That will affect the teachers here, Heather, thank you, and the other teachers there. No one's thinking about that impact on that, nor the impact of me potentially just packing up, because I have a job. I telecommute from New York City. I can pack up my family and move any point in time. And that's another choice I have, fantastic. And I think that there's a lot more families that without that choice who will have a mass exodus out of Vermont. And so how do you then equate for the loss of property taxes there, the loss of my income, others like me, my income, and how that affects the state of Vermont since I've moved here? I'm learning and finding a lot of telecommuters that live in Vermont that take advantage of living in very remote areas. I don't live in Sandgate just because I love the mountains and the sticks. I mean, it's remote. You're not close to other things. The internet sucks. The Wi-Fi absolutely sucks. But we have fantastic advantages that we moved here for. And now it's like, oh, crap. They're all going to go. I mean.
So let me reiterate. Act 46, for any community to lose choice, that community must vote to lose choice. If nothing is done, and it goes, I have the timeline up there, it goes to the Agency of Education and the State Board of Education. The Agency of Education and the State Board of Education is forbidden to take choice away from this community, and they're forbidden from closing the school in this community unless the school is proven to be substandard. And there are standards in place that determine whether a school is substandard. And from everything I hear, Arlington excels. So that is the plain facts. I know there's a lot of misinformation, myths, distortion of the truth out there. The fact of the matter is, this bill, this act, does not stop choice only unless a community votes to do it. If it moves to the state, as Cynthia has pointed out, for the Agency of Education to put your community with other communities, they may not take away choice in the process of doing that.
Right, and that's
Oliver?
Okay.
So if I can just chime in,
But we have to find out
well, let me just chime in here, guys. So I represent, so first of all, I live in Londonderry, which is a choice town for 9 through 12. I've got three kids. I represent a number of towns that have a variety of choice, including Winhall and Stratton, which both have choice very much like Sandgate, K through 12. I think Dave would agree, there's nobody who barks louder on the issue of school choice than me in the legislature. It's something I hold very sacred, and there's no way I am going to let the state roll over school choice. It's not going to happen, not while I'm up there. So I just want to be really clear that there are protections put into this bill for school choice. Now, as far as Sandgate goes, I can tell you, I know Winhall and Stratton are having conversations, and I believe they've already had conversations with Sandgate. There are opportunities to come together, and when you pull these smaller choice communities together as a larger unit, they actually become stronger. They have a stronger voice. There are also financial benefits to coming together, because as you may, for folks in Sandgate, I know because I look at the finances of this whole area, your tax rate goes up and down like a yo-yo because you have a small student population. And when you have 1 or 2 students move in or out, it sends your tax rate, basically up and down dramatically. So one of the advantages of Act 46, and I think actually it will strengthen school choice in many of these communities, is you get together, you now have a larger group of students, so you smooth out those sharp peaks and valleys that you have in the system. Now, there are issues, and I think it needs to be recognized. Sunderland D&B Mount Tabor, where they have choice at 7th and 8th. They don't have choice. They both operate their own schools. So though this law is not perfect, and when we go back in January, we're going to have to look at trying to deal with some of these edge cases, and they do exist out there. But I think, to the woman here's point, the change is never easy. This is incredibly difficult, and if you were going back to Dave's original point, if you were going to redesign the system, there's no way we would design the system we have today. But the last thing any of us want is for the state to come in, because a really simple fix, much simpler than Act 46, would just be to have the state draw a map, draw a bunch of new lines and say, here you go. That's really simple, but it's not going to give us what we want. So if you get to where a system that our local communities actually want, it becomes really complicated because it relies on this public input process and the conversations that we're having here. So I hear you, I understand the frustration that's out there. This is going to be a really difficult transition, but if we work together and we have the dialogue and the open communication between communities, I'm confident that we can get to a good place here.
Ask a clarification on Act 46. I know Sandgate is a tuitioning town, Win Hall's a tuitioning town, Stratton's a tuitioning town there, and for K through 12. And all of them have the option of coming together within a bigger supervisory union. Am I correct?
Correct.
Right now, as I understand it, Celeste, you can help me out, Sheila. Sandgate tuitions at a much lower rate than Win Hall or Stratton.
Yeah, they pay the minimum average
So we pay
independent rate.
the average state tuition. Would Sandgate be required to tuition at that higher rate if they were to join with Win Hall and Stratton, which would raise our taxes?
So what the way the process works is that a study group is formed. And what communities did you mention? Sandgate, Sutherland?
Win Hall.
Okay, so
Stratton, Win Hall, Ira.
so you take proportional number of members, 3 to 5 members from each of those communities, and you put them together in a study committee, and then you hammer out articles of agreement. And those articles of agreement specify a lot of how whether a school board's going to exist or not. If it exists, what's its function going to be? For those communities that tuition K through 12, there's not much of a function of a school board except for to pay, write a check. But there still may be agreements that need to be hammered out between these communities, and that's one of them. What will the tuition?
They would have to choose a rate as opposed to.
I believe it would have to be. I don't know the answer to that. The lawyers would know the answer to that, and there is help in building these. To your question earlier, do I know the details? There is the State School Boards Association, the Agency of Education, the Superintendent's Association, and others are willing and able to come to these studies groups and help hammer out these issues for these communities. So I don't know the answer. Would they all have to tuition at the same rate?
Gone to our recent meeting with.
Pardon?
Kind of having gone to a recent school board meeting with a number of the parents who were here. Sandgate seems to be looking at a substantial rate of increase in our taxes, whatever we choose.
Either way.
And where Sandgate can't afford to,
Or
people
doing
in
nothing.
Sandgate, we can't, whatever we do, our taxes are going to skyrocket because of what we're required, what is required of us by Act 46. And Sandgaters can't afford that. Sandgate will empty out. There are really 2 reasons to move to Sandgate if your parents didn't live there, which is school choice or lower taxes than a lot of the surrounding town.
Yeah.
We're not convenient to anything. It takes 10 minutes to get
10?
twice a pound. This is what makes Sandgate.
I would recommend.
It's super pretty up there.
It is
Well, but
Helps with the stress levels of fire tax.
I grew up up there.
I think Sandgate is buffered by a lot of federal forest money.
No, that's Sunderland.
That's
Sunderland. No, but I
So-
think that's really interesting about the tuition, and I had not thought of that, because many towns pay the full tuition,
We pay the same
and you
rate.
pay the independent average, and I think that's something to look at for merger of choice towns. I hadn't thought of that, that's a really interesting point.
So there are people that do know the answer to that and would work through a study group to try to find resolution that would work for all the members of the study group.
When would these mergers between school choice towns have to happen?
The timeline,
2019.
Yeah, that's what they-
Depends on how much of it, you get different tax rewards to it earlier, but like 2019,
So
you
like
gotta
we're
be
gonna
done.
get checked through work.
No, it's offset.
No, it
by
doesn't
the-
sound
it's
like it,
offset
does it?
by the-
I'm so surprised.
And then everyone else is paying for it anyway, so like, who's paying for
So-
those, who's paying for those?
so in terms of paying for it, I got the latest, and I didn't display it because it's incredibly detailed, but I got the latest educational fund outlook. It shows $20 million of surplus left on the bottom line, and it would be my recommendation to the legislature that we set that aside to pay for incentives that are included in Act 46 so that it won't in fact impact property taxes.
Yeah, but that is property tax revenue that could have been used to reduce rates, and the state's gonna use property tax revenue to reward districts.
Or it could be general fund revenue.
Most of it's property tax revenue.
So the timeline for accelerated mergers, which is an SU becoming a school district, has to be pretty quick. Voted by the electorate by next July. Conventional mergers approved by the electorate by 2017. Alternative structures submitted proposal for the alternative structure to the state board by November of 2017. That allows a later vote on the community in the November timeframe of 2017. Then proposed structures, the secretary submits a plan for proposed structures to the state board by June of 2018. And all of these will be operational by 2019.
So the town votes 3 years later it goes into.
So how much of this is
Give
already
us all
set in
some
stone and how much is still?
Sure.
It's all in process.
Comparison of
Anything that would
Sandgate
change, all you need
and
to know.
Winhall's a rich district, and the ski areas
This did not
and all
pass
that.
by law.
Sandgate is relatively poor district, I think.
20 votes.
So how do you establish a tax rate for this new district?
The tax rate would be a blended tax rate, and it would eventually be the same tax rate for both communities. The incentives, 10 cents, 8 cents, 6 cents, 4 cents, 2 cents, is meant to smooth that. And then there's further a stipulation that it can't increase by more than 5% in any given year until parity is reached.
Well, with that scenario, it seems to me that the Sandgate tax rate would probably go down if it's blended with Winhall, which is a much wealthier town.
So town wealth isn't directly connected to tax rates anymore. What's directly connected to tax rates is your per pupil expenditure. I will say in general, one reason why we haven't reached equity entirely in our state is that you actually pay money out of your back pocket, not out of the dirt in your backyard. So it's how much money you have available to pay taxes. And poorer communities, tax rates and per pupil spending tends to be significantly lower than communities with higher incomes. So, so the low-income communities tend to have lower tax rates than the high-income communities. And they tend to spend a lot less money per pupil than the high-spending community, the high-wealth communities in our state.
One other question that relates to that. Where does the taxes now are income sensitive.
Yep.
What makes up the difference? In other words, you get a tax bill from the town. That tax bill is adjusted.
Yes.
Not that mine is now. It was 1 year when I did take a totally retired 1 year.
Yeah.
And I noticed that, oh wow, my taxes went down. Who made that difference up?
Other taxpayers in the state.
In the
It
state.
came from other property taxpayers, sales and income taxpayers. All the education fund that goes back to my first slide operates as a whole unit.
So anyone who's income sensitized, other property taxpayers are making up that difference. The state is not doing it. The education fund is making up that difference, which includes some state funds.
Includes income tax, sales tax, non-homestead tax, and homestead tax.
Do you have any statistics, I mean, you say this transition will be done by 2020, and a lot of this is due to decreasing tax base from retirees, and at some point that's gonna level off. But how much, is any of this due also to people leaving the state altogether? I mean, taxpayers younger taxpayers leaving the state, and do you have any sense that that's gonna level off at some point?
Are you doing anything to help it?
So there's lots of anecdotal and some statistical analysis that it's more or less a steady line. We do lose some taxpayers, but we gain taxpayers. Some will argue that we gain higher taxpayers than we lose. Some will argue otherwise. But I think the statistics are fuzzy enough so that it's hard to make a solid argument one way or another.
But isn't the labor force shrinking?
Yeah, the student enrollment is shrinking,
mostly
right?
due to retirements.
Right. Right. But that's an important characteristic in the demographic profile.
Right, that's right. Yeah. Yes, Oliver.
So since 2007, we've lost about 10,000 tax filers under age 65, income tax filers.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to come down here. I hope there's a better understanding of Act 46 and our financing system and the crisis that we're facing in education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Alice Miller came in, she's a representative here locally. Shaftesbury. Is there anything that any of the other representatives who are here tonight would like to address? Larry or Bernie, Oliver, is there something that you'd like to see? Cynthia?
I think I've already said a lot of it. I'm happy to keep talking.
But just in case, there may be something that you'd like to address to one of these other representatives.
I still feel like my question was answered. It's not just education that's coming out of the education fund. Are there any other measures that are being taken to address everything else is dipping into that fund?
Well, I think,
come out of that fund.
no, there's the income sensitivity, which we just talked about. There's a shift in, from all property tax, or the entire ed fund, to subsidize the property taxes of some property taxpayers who pay based on income, which is a lot of us. And that's probably a good policy, but it is in fact a shift. It's not going directly to education. Current use is also lost tax revenue. Current use is agricultural and forestry. They pay based on the use value of their property. Again, very good program, but it's lost tax revenue. And then there's things like the pre-K, which is a new mandate. Again, very good program. The state did not increase its transfer to the ed fund to pay for that mandate. And some 3 or 4 years ago, the state unilaterally rebased the calculation of its transfer to the ed fund, so they reduced it by $27 million, which is almost 3 cents on the property tax rate. And they've never really made that up. So to my mind, the state has underfunded its transfer. The state has continually put in mandates. The state has continually manipulated who pays what. And the cost, before there was an ed fund, before Act 60, the cost of income sensitivity supporting people, the cost of current use was paid for in the general fund. Now that we have the education fund and its state education property tax, those costs have been shifted in there. Again, I support those programs, but they're not education. And they shouldn't be in the ed fund.
On the other hand, pension is not taken out of the education fund. The cost of teachers' pension, and do you happen to know the number off the top of your head?
20 million a year?
Oh no, it's more like 70.
A year?
Yeah.
But see, that was the deal between the teachers and the state back in 1947.
Nevertheless, it's education money that's not coming out of the education fund.
That's coming out of the general fund?
It's coming out of the general fund.
It's basically not
So,
being paid.
to more directly answer your question, here is the, I didn't put this slide up because there's a lot of detail here, but here's uses of the education fund. 1.289 billion goes directly to schools.
Goes directly where?
Schools.
When we say schools, is that K-12?
That's K-12,
or-
operating and tuition. It goes to pay for student education directly.
But it's just K through 12?
Yes.
Not pre-K.
Not, oh yeah, pre-K too.
Pre-K,
No.
Pre-K
not
too.
community college or?
179.8 billion, 179.8 million is special ed. State placed students is 16.4 million, so that's direct student education. 17.7 is transportation, we support busing in the state. 13.3 is tech ed, so subsidizing tech education. 7.6 in small schools grants, 6.4 in early education, 5.8 in adult education and literacy, 3.6 in the high schools of Vermont. That's
the corrections department.
That's high schools in jail. The single biggest high school in the state, I believe, is still in the corrections department. 6.8 in a renter rebate program. 3.4 goes to listers across the state to help with reappraisal.
Sorry, what's the renter's rebate?
Renter's rebate is, so this predates Act 60. We have a program that is not income sensitivity. It's called the super circuit breaker. I guess that if your household income is less than 47,000, so if you own a home and your household income is less than 47,000, the combination of your municipal property taxes and your education property taxes cannot exceed 5.5%.
Okay.
If I got that right. And if it's 25,000, it's 3.5%. If it's less than 10,000, it's 2% or something like that. So as a mate to that program for renters, the same parameters are in place, 47,000 or less, you get a rebate on your rent.
And the reason, Dave, for that is that the rental property is taxed at the higher, what's typically a higher non-residential rate.
Non-residential.
So the landlords pass that cost off onto the tenants.
But you also need to be sure, you also need to be sure that you see that here is the income sensitivity adjusted, 158 million. Again, before there was an education fund, that property tax adjustment, the circuit breaker, was paid for in the general fund. And now it's here. So that is the cost of having some people pay by income. Again, I think that's a good program, but it's essentially a housing subsidy program, and I'm not sure it belongs here. The cost of current use isn't even shown here, and that's about 50 million. So those are the things that I'm concerned about, because having this here, right there, that's 16 cents on the property tax rate. So having it here actually drives up the property tax rate. If you put it back in the general fund where it belongs, the property tax rate comes down. Now you still have to figure out how to pay for it in the general fund, which is not going to be easy. But I don't think hiding it here, when it was historically a state obligation, I don't think that's the right solution. And then lecturing schools for driving up their cost when part of the high property tax rates is due to how the state has managed and exploited the education fund. And that's one of my problems with this entire endeavor.
There's been a huge amount of energy and effort that's gone into creating Act 46. It is not perfect, but the people who are working on it are seeking to represent you the best they can. And that's why we're here tonight, because we care about the decisions that are made, and because we're serious about trying to do our best for the people in our areas that we represent. And so there are going to be differences of opinion, but by working together, it helps all of us. We love Vermont. Vermont's a place we have chosen to live, and we love it. We want it to succeed and to work for every parent in every family, whether you live in Sandgate or where I live in Manchester. And so what happens to that whole dialogue really consists of how we take what we learn and utilize the knowledge that we get to support our constituents, our families, our parents, and the students in our area. And I think we can work this out. We have some time, but Act 46 is a very difficult document, but something had to be done. And this is what we have to talk about now. And let's continue the dialogue, move forward and do something that's constructive and beneficial for our towns and then families and the children that go to our schools, because that's really the bottom line. It's all about our children and to provide the best for our children and to give the best choices for families to do what they need to do for their children. So thank you all very much for
Thank you
coming
very
out
much.
tonight.
I'd like to personally thank all the representatives for coming tonight. It was tough questions, and we appreciate your time. We appreciate those who traveled great distances. And I would just ask everyone to please continue to voice your opinion and write letters and really speak up for what you guys
Right.
need.
Very important.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
I'm Alice Miller, and I represent Shaftesbury, Glastonbury, a little bit of Sunderland. I'm so glad that David Sharp and other people are on the education committee. I'm one of them. Two in the back, Larry and Bernie. What do I want to say? What I want to say is this. I'm so glad that they have heard you in particular, because what they've heard is passion, love of your children and your schools. They've heard that you're doing very well. You've been through a battle before with the commissioner and you've won. Your kids are doing well, but you have a problem. You're too small. And your numbers need to increase. What's your average per pupil expenditure here? In my town, it's about 14,000 in Shaftesbury. What is it here? Cynthia, do you know?
I don't know, it might be 16 or
What is it?
15, I don't know.
I think it's pretty good. I think you're around the same as me.
Oliver knows.
I think you're around 14. I think you're, look it up. I think you're around 14,000.
For Arlington, I think it's higher than that. I think it might be 17 or 18.
I don't think so, but see if you can find it. But anyway, so that would have to be fixed for sure, because people can't afford that. The property taxes are just too darn high. We've lost too many kids, 28,000 kids.
So bring more kids in.
What?
Bring more kids in, bring in jobs. Make people want to come out.
Okay, but we have to deal with the reality of today.
This is the reality of
Lower
lower
property taxes.
jobs are leaving, not coming in.
14,000.
You have.
Well, that's your education.
It's too late now to start this conversation. All I can tell you, is you have the opportunity now to get together, to take a look at yourselves, just like everybody else in the state. Just look at yourselves. You may come up with something creative and new and different to improve upon your situation. And if you can't, and if you think you have the best in the world that there is to offer at an affordable cost for the people who live in your communities, remember that. They have to be able to afford what we're doing. And many people are screaming, hundreds and hundreds of people are screaming, we can't afford an educational system that has grown from 800,000 a few years ago to 1.5 billion today. So you've got to take some responsibility for that. Now maybe you have, and maybe you're not spending that much. But it really, if you are, you have to look at that and be fair about it. Help your communities, help your people to get an education, a high-quality education they can afford. I really appreciate what you're doing. I sit on that committee, and believe me, Cynthia will make sure I represent you. and I'll make sure I represent you, and so will Steve. So we're there for you. But help us too, by looking at yourselves, studying yourselves, and seeing what you can do to make the situation better statewide.
Thank you, Alice. And again, thank you, Representative Dave Sharp, for coming down from Bristol.